Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the final panel for today. And I'm excited to host this panel. The title of the panel is Black Migration to the Global North, Challenging White Supremacy Through History and Belonging. And we have four really exciting panelists this afternoon, and I will introduce them as they're about to present. And I'll start with Mimi Scheller. Mimi Scheller is Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Her research interests include sustainable mobility and mobility justice, Caribbean studies and mobilities, and tracing the histories and forecasting the futures of cultures of mobility. She holds a continuing appointment as Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University in the UK, and is founding co-editor of the international journal Mobilities. She is on the international editorial boards of the journals Cultural Sociology and African and Black Diaspora. She is the author of the books Consuming the Caribbean, which explores relations of production and consumption in the transatlantic world, from the colonial era until today, Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica. And she recently completed Citizenship from Below, Caribbean Agency and Modern Freedom, which is forthcoming, Duke University Press. Professor Scheller is also co-editor with John Uri of Mobile Technologies of the City and Tourism Mobilities, as well as a special issue of Environment and Planning on Materialities and Mobilities. The title of her talk presentation is Beyond Disaster Discourses, Haitian Migration and Mobility Justice Across the Americas. I now invite Professor Scheller to begin.
Thank you so much, Patsy, and apologies that bio is extremely out of date. I'm not sure, I should have sent you something new. I'm not sure where that came from, but
I'm sorry, that's what happens when you don't send us updated bios. We rely on what we can get our hands on. Apologies. How about just spending a few minutes correcting the bio? We'd love to hear the updated version.
I'll reference some of my new books in the talk I'm giving, so don't worry. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's been excellent panels today. Unfortunately, I missed yesterday, but the students this morning were amazing. If anybody was here to catch them, and the other panelists were very inspiring. I am speaking from Central Massachusetts, and I would like to begin by recognizing the people of the Chabuna-Gungamwak Nipmuc tribe as the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live. And I want to take this moment to honor their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I am going to share my screen. Let's see. And speak to you today about questions around migration and mobility justice, pertaining especially to Haitians in this current context, but also thinking about it historically. So I want to begin by talking about the containment of Haiti from its first revolutionary moments, which I believe is the context in which we need to think about migration and borders in the Americas. Of course, we know that after the Haitian Revolution, the Constitution of Haiti granted automatic citizenship to anyone of African or Amerindian origin and invited these peoples to settle in Haiti, while other foreigners were prevented from owning any property there. This was a powerful statement, and the slaveholding powers refused to recognize Haiti and began the commercial embargo and blockade that forced Haiti to pay the 150 million franc indemnity to France, beginning in 1825 and lasting for decades. In fact, it wasn't finally paid off until 1947. The US refused to recognize Haiti. And I believe that any discussion of decolonial migration and mobilities must recognize this foundational historical challenge to the white colonial slaveocracy, how it led to the debt to the US occupation, which was in part to take the Haitian treasury for debt payments. And then that occupation from 1915 to 1934 led to the establishment of the Duvalier presidencies, which instigated this period of large-scale migration into what we call the diaspora. So that is like the beginnings of the modern era, where we see the so-called boat people, the interceptions of Haitians at sea, their confinement at Guantanamo Bay, and deportations. So it's just a reminder of kind of the deep history we begin from. And then fast forward to September 2021. The border crisis built on what I would call the production of crisis, when we see the Del Rio, Texas, disastrous humanitarian situation with 14,000 people forced to camp under a highway overpass. Many of these migrants had been living in Brazil or Chile or other Latin American countries since the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And the Biden administration began deporting thousands of these people back to Haiti. And I apologize, my internet says it's unstable, so I hope this is coming through okay. So US policy in Latin America and the Caribbean creates bordering practices which are a violation of international law, which produces these repeated media spectacles of racialized exclusion and the real human consequences that this has. Secondly, we find ourselves in the situation of pandemic immobilities and mobilities. The viral mobilities of COVID unleashed not just a mobility disruption that many sort of North Americans experienced it as, but also a vast intensification of already existing relations of uneven mobilities and immobilities, where it became almost impossible to cross a border and file an asylum claim. And yet we also know that before COVID-19, there was already this selective closure of national spaces to racialized bodies, as Alvarez Velasco puts it, and this restriction and intense unequal mobilities in the sort of global regimes of movement. So it was not just the pandemic, but that intensified it. And I want to refer here to the excellent work of Henderson, Jozef, and Federico Nieberg, which is published in Portuguese on immobility and the pandemic in Haitian landscapes. And they argue that Haitian life depends on movement, the street economy, the going and coming between the countryside and cities, mobility in international circuits in which are generated the remittances sent to those who reside in the country. People, places, economies are in motion at different scales. And so they speak about the informal economy itself as mobility. It's about cultivating this sense of timing, looking for a better life, what Haitians call chercher la vie. And it's both personal and collective, it's material and moral, and it implies a relationality between those who move and those who stay in place. The pandemic changed this mobility regime. Thousands of residents abroad did not manage to return from Haiti to their countries of residence. In the diaspora, thousands of those affected by the crisis wished to return voluntarily, and in other cases, especially in the US and Dominican Republic, they were forced to leave, being deported to Haiti. Thirdly, we can think of another situation, which is that of climate, which is sometimes referred to as climate migration. I choose to call it climate mobilities, drawing on a forthcoming special issue that I'm contributing to the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies with these wonderful co-editors, where they theorize climate mobilities as a way to highlight the multiplicity of mobilities and immobilities and their interplay with other mobile flows of ideas, information, and climate risk. So it's to get us away from the sort of negative connotation of climate refugees flooding our borders, and to really think about these complex, different kinds of mobilities and immobilities that climate change is producing. For example, Hurricane Dorian in 2019, where we saw, as Angelique Nixon puts it, Haitian migrants and Haitian Bahamians as the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in the Bahamas. This was not about climate refugees flooding out. This was about people entrapped, immobilized, because they were fearful to seek shelter in the storm. And immediately after, we saw things like in the lower left, Operation Sovereign Bahamas, calling for eradicating illegal immigrants in the Bahamas, shantytowns down. That was an event held at the Church of God. So I'm drawing here on my two more recent books, Mobility Justice, published in 2018, and Island Futures, that came out about a year ago in 2020, which reflected on a 10-year process of doing research on post-earthquake and post-disaster, post-hurricane recovery in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the wider Caribbean. And through this work, I've come to think about the ideas of mobility justice as a kind of mobile commoning as socially produced rules for sharing and moving together with others. Neither private nor public. Commoning suggests a temporary dwelling and moving place or pattern. The commons is not just a sort of still shared territory or natural resource, but I want to theorize it as a radical way of moving together in the world, sharing spaces, and crucially, refusing private property. How can such practices of overlapping access to mobile commons and assertions of mobility sovereignty help us envision transitions towards greater mobility justice? So the concept of mobile commoning draws in part on work in migration studies, for example, Papadopoulos and Tsianos, who talk about the Central American caravans as the invisible knowledge of mobility, the infrastructure of connectivity, the multiplicity of informal economies, the diverse forms of transnational communities of justice, and the politics of care. And those are some of the things we heard about in earlier panels today, for example, on the Mesoamericas and the Mayan people's movements for migration justice and land justice. So indigenous mobile commons can be thought of also in relation to mobility sovereignty. So we know indigenous peoples were expropriated and displaced despite treaties which gave groups implied perpetuity of the right to passage, to hunt, to fish, and gather food across certain lands and waterways. That was violated in the white settler states, which seized and violently cleared land for both private and public property. And as Alicia Schmidt Camacho argued this morning, indigenous people are mobilizing against authoritarian and extractive regimes, creating what she called plurinations and transnations. And we heard from Emile Quemé and Juanita Cabrera Lopez about how the Chortimaya are resisting in these kinds of ways. Recent critical indigenous studies call for reclaiming mobility sovereignty. And there's a forthcoming issue of the journal Mobilities edited by Carpio, Nachi, and Barraclough, which argues that settler colonial spaces are structures of mobility and justice. They are created via assertions of power over movements and attached directly to claims or projections of ownership and belonging. And what is mobility sovereignty? They propose the concept as an interdisciplinary analytic to refer to the ability to choose when, where, how, and for what purposes to engage in movement. They see this as an alignment with indigenous studies, and they understand mobility sovereignty both at the scale of the body and the scale of the collective. And this struggle to enact mobility sovereignty draws on indigenous understandings of place, more than human relations, and mutual responsibility as central elements in the ongoing struggle for decolonization. Ultimately, they argue the political project of mobility sovereignty is as important to the work of decolonization as the rematriation of land. I would add likewise that there are anti-slavery counter-plantation mobile commons, or what Moten and Harvey called undercommons, common forms of landholding that emerged in post-slavery settings, and in particular in Haiti, the laku, or family land, to which people can come and go as members of their family. And while away in the diaspora, they contribute to the laku, and then they return there when needed to feed the spirits. So access to this kind of collective land is not just about the land, it's about the mobile commoning related to it. So reclaiming the Afro-Indigenous mobile commons. Commoning takes place along urban edges and interstitial spaces such as provision grounds, the plot, marronage, at the juncture of built-in natural environments, urban and national formations, and on fugitive peripheries of geopolitical ecologies. So I want to think of the Haitian Lakou as a mobile commons anchoring these claims to chercher la vie wherever needed. And I want to point out the importance of mobility to prevent, as Jozef and Nieberg put it, to prevent the deceased soul from continuing its journey to Guinan or to paradise. That's what being unable to move suggests. And this is linked to a history and memory of slavery and marronage and current events. And I just want to end, because I know our time is short, with the idea of building solidarities and the Haitian Dominican cultural movement as way, which has just won the UNESCO Transcultural Program call. And they seek to challenge the prevailing rhetoric between splitting the Dominican Republic and Haiti by pointing towards their Taino origin as a powerful symbol of common heritage. So thank you. I will end there with a beautiful picture of a Haitian rural household. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mimi, for introducing these very fascinating concepts that I'm sure we'll come back to in the question and answer period in our discussion section. Thank you. Introducing Christopher Loperena, who is assistant professor in the PhD program in anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Christopher Loperena's research examines indigenous and Black territorial struggles, land extractivism, and the socio-spatial politics of economic development in Honduras. He has served as an expert witness at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and in support of asylum claimants from Central America. His work has been published in numerous scholarly journals, including American Anthropologist, American Quarterly, Current Anthropology, and Geoforum. In addition, he recently co-edited 2 themed issues on the role of cultural evidence in the adjudication of indigenous and Afro-descendant rights in Latin America. He was a Cesar Chavez Fellow at Dartmouth College and Professor of International Studies at the University of San Francisco, before assuming his position at the Graduate Center at CUNY. His current book project, entitled A Fragmented Paradise, Anti-Blackness and the Rise of Progress in Honduras, is under contract with Stanford University Press. The title of his presentation is The Persistence of American Supremacy, Anti-Blackness, Anthropology, and the Black Asylum Seekers.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see my my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is that okay? There we go.
Yeah.
So first, of course, I want to thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and especially Dr. Patsy Lewis for the invitation to present my work here today. And also thank you to my co-panelists. I was able to attend the last panel, and I really enjoyed all that I learned. This is sort of a new area of writing for me, and I look forward to your questions and comments. The ideology of American supremacy is intimately tethered to the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is and will always be a pillar of democratic freedoms and opportunities. Indeed, the preamble to the 2016 Republican Party platform states, quote, "We believe in American exceptionalism. We believe the United States of America is unlike any other nation on earth. We believe America is exceptional because of our historic role, first as refuge, then as defender, and now as exemplar of liberty for the world to see. The power of American exceptionalism lies in its ability to uphold the mythological origins of the United States as an exceptional space of freedom and democracy, and at the same time deflect the foundational violence on which this country was founded. It is thus complicit with white supremacy. American exceptionalism has further served as a justification for US military interventions in Latin America, often carried out in defense of US corporate interests, and subsequently for emergent border security regimes. As a practice of citizenship, American exceptionalism makes it possible for someone like Enrique Tarrio to be the visible non-white leader of a white nationalist group, the Proud Boys, at the same time that it structures humanitarian debates on how to handle the recent arrival of migrant caravans from Central America and at the US southern border. Since 2016, I have worked as a country expert on over a dozen legal cases involving undocumented Black and Indigenous asylum seekers from Honduras. These individuals are not merely escaping poverty and gang violence, as prominently reported in the media. Rather, they are fleeing a predatory political economic system that is premised on life-annihilating resource extraction within their territories, which social movement activists there have begun to refer to as the Sistema de la Muerte, or the death system. In this talk, I will focus on the case of a woman asylum seeker who, after many years of severe sexual and emotional abuse, fled Honduras for the United States. The claimant was perceived to be of African descent, but self-identified as non-Black. In my affidavit, I argued that in order to make sense of the gender and race-based persecution she suffered, it was necessary to understand anti-Black racism as an historically rooted structuring force, which targets people of African descent or people with features deemed to be African in origin. One might assume that a structural analysis of racism would be out of place in US immigration court, but I have found the opposite to be true. Indeed, in this case, the court granted asylum. I contend that the court's willingness to grant asylum is not due to a larger cultural shift within US society, but in fact rooted in the pernicious logics of American supremacy. Proving the rights worthiness of one individual serves to buttress the notion of the United States as refuge, and in turn, the larger system of racialized criminalization, in which failure to prove your innocence before the law results in imprisonment, deportation, and in some cases, death. The number of adult migrants crossing the United States-Mexico border has ebbed and flowed in recent years, with peaks of migrant apprehensions in 2014, 2019, and 2021. Many of these migrants hailed from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, the so-called Northern Triangle. However, the crisis of unaccompanied minors immigrating from Central America to the United States and the much maligned migrant caravans that followed did not spontaneously erupt in 2014, as many of the other panelists have shared with us today. Rather, their roots lie in a deeper history of economic exploitation aided by US military and imperial interventions in the region, which peaked during the revolutionary wars of El Salvador and Nicaragua, and which during the 1980s and 1990s incited large flows of migration to the United States. This shameful history of US government support for anti-democratic forces was reiterated in June 2009 when the State Department tacitly supported the coup d'etat against Honduran President Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya was demonized by Honduras's powerful oligarchy for his increasingly left-leaning political ambitions, which the State Department also deemed to be a threat to its interests in the region. His ousting had only exacerbated the problems that have made life in Honduras unlivable for many of its most vulnerable inhabitants. Following the coup d'etat, the Honduran per capita murder rate surged to 86.5 per 100,000 people, at that time one of the highest in the world. And in 2017, Honduras was named the most deadly country in the world for land and environmental activists. Understanding this history is crucial, but we must also contend with how political economic forces and contaminant processes of environmental plunder disproportionately impact historically racialized populations. And there's an excellent special issue that deals with this as well, that was produced by Maylee Blackwell, Floridama Bosch Lopez, and Luis Urrieta Jr. Conditions of precarity are aggravated along racial lines, with Black and Indigenous people suffering the heaviest losses from the onset of neoliberal policies and free market economic restructuring, backed by the US, and the related expansion of extractivist economic activities into their territories. For Garifuna, a Black Indigenous people who lay claim to large expanses of land along the Caribbean coastline, tourism and agribusiness are the primary industries driving them off of their ancestral lands. US government apathy for the plight of the Honduran people has been laid bare by increasingly restrictive immigration policies and a rollback of asylum protections. On the cusp of the 2020 presidential elections, the Trump administration instated a drastic cut in the number of refugees that would be permitted to legally enter the country. He also proceeded aggressively with his plans to build a wall along the entire southwest border from California to Texas. These policies were designed to strengthen his base of support, principally in rural regions of the country, which had for decades endured a hollowing out of their economies via neoliberal deindustrialization. Ironically, it was these same structural conditions that had decimated local economies throughout Central America, leaving many rural communities there more vulnerable to the vagaries of global commodity markets, which dictate not only what is to be produced and consumed, but the types of labor regimes that are necessary to be competitive in the global market. Dispossession and ecological degradation followed. Predictably, the Trump administration represented migrants from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras as threatening to the job security of US citizens. But perhaps more importantly, he used fear-mongering tactics rooted in white supremacist discourse to position Central American migrants as a threat to the country's safety and health. He referred to them as rapists, criminals, and potential vectors for the spread of disease. In short, the perceived racial and moral inferiority of Hondurans, Central Americans, Haitians, and other migrants of non-white origin posed an existential threat to global American supremacy and thus necessitated strict immigration laws and policies to keep migrants from crossing the border. Significantly, the Biden administration has kept in place many of Trump's most controversial immigration policies, including holding children in detention camps at the US-Mexico border and using the Center for Disease Control's Title 42 authority to keep refugees in Mexico, presumably an attempt to protect US citizens from COVID-19. The asylum claimants I have worked with all suffered physical or sexual violence on account of their race. In most of the cases, the claimant has also petitioned for protected status on account of their political opinion. The case I will discuss now is striking for its atypical characteristics. One, the claim was premised on domestic violence, which the claimant, who I referred to as Suani, believed was racially motivated. And two, the claimant was not Black or Indigenous identified. However, after reviewing the client's declaration, it was clear that her perceived Blackness was a crucial factor in the violence she suffered. Suani was born in a small village in the department of Yoro, about 150 kilometers south of the coastal city of La Ceiba. In Honduras, the majority of the country's Black population is concentrated along the Caribbean coast in dozens of small Garifuna communities in the Honduran Mosquitia and in the cities of La Ceiba, Tela, and Trujillo. The interior of the country, particularly within rural areas, is notable for the demographic absence of Black peoples. Indeed, Suani's birthplace is a majority mestizo or Latino town. Mestizo is a term used to categorize people of mixed Indigenous and European heritage, which in the Honduran context excludes Blackness. Tracing this racial geography was an important component of my expert declaration in support of her case, since as Suani argued, her darker skin tone and curly hair made her a subject of ridicule among her schoolmates and even members of her own family who were ashamed of her, quote, African features. In school and around town, she was called names such as Morenita, little Black girl, Garifuna, Negra fea, ugly Black woman, and other racial epithets. All Suani's immediate relatives were, according to her, light-skinned. After her mother migrated to the United States, Suani went to live with their grandparents. The modest two-bedroom house was occupied by multiple members of her extended family, including her aunt and uncle. At the age of 8, Suani's uncle began to sexually abuse her. The abuse began with inappropriate touching and eventually progressed to rape at the age of 15. When Suani reported the rape to her grandparents, her aunt accused her of fabricating the story for attention and then beat her. Afraid to speak out again, she endured almost daily sexual violence for years. When Suani turned 19, she left her grandmother's home to start a relationship with the father of her firstborn child. But the relationship did not last, and shortly thereafter, she was forced to return to her family home. In 2010, Suani's mother, who was living and working in the United States, purchased a home for Suani and her 2 children. Suani visited her grandparents infrequently in an attempt to minimize contact with her uncle, but he continued to torment her with verbal threats. After he found out she was pregnant with her 3rd child, he became enraged and insisted that her young daughter would be his next victim. Terrified, she retreated back to her mother's house where she lived alone and in fear of further violence. Soon after, she fled for the United States. In her declaration, Suani claimed she was targeted by her uncle because she was dark-skinned. She believed her African racial features made her uniquely vulnerable to his sexual predations. In short, because her features were deemed to be Black adjacent, her body and her personal well-being was not deemed as valuable as the other woman in her family. In my declaration, I situated the racial violence that Suwani experienced within a broader engagement with the history and contemporary practices of anti-Blackness in Honduras. Although she did not identify as Garifuna or Black, I drew on research that documents the history of racial animosity towards Garifuna, including repeated attempts on the part of the state to expropriate Garifuna lands for extractivist developments in tourism and agribusiness. The dispossession of Garifuna lands is rooted in a much longer history of pillage that views Black and Indigenous territories as development frontiers, and which positions Blackness as external to the nation. In detailing this history, I sought to establish a general pattern of violence to which Suwani was also susceptible as someone who was perceived as Black. In general, violence against women in Honduras is underreported, and the perpetrators of this violence go mostly unprosecuted. In 2015, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reported that impunity for crimes against women surpasses 95%, and these rates are almost certainly higher for Afro-descendant women, demonstrating how Black and Indigenous lives are made disposable within this context, and how specifically Black and Indigenous women get positioned as objects of sex or as socially expendable is a crucial component of the work of witnessing. As experts, making structural racism and intersectional modalities of oppression visible to the court is part of the labor we must do, but doing so may also contribute to entrenched racial thinking about Latin American peoples and societies, depicted as exceptionally corrupt, racist, and distinctly machista. Gilberto Rosas refers to this as necrosubjection, which he links to racial liberalism. To garner asylum or relief from deportation, he argues, increasingly demands accounts of deep victimization on behalf of individuals and collectivities, playing to deeply ingrained paternalism found in liberalisms of today. Thus, although anthropologists have labored to undo our discipline's past complicity with scientific racism and modes of othering, our entree into the legal arena as experts and into the arena of asylum law in particular entails submitting ourselves to racial liberalism's rulebook. In other words, anthropologists can provide evidence that aids an individual in obtaining asylum, but doing this work often reinforces the moral and political precepts of liberalism, which, as the late Charles Mills reminds us, was always racial insofar as it denies equal personhood to people of color. How is it that the US, a country that is globally derided for its racist treatment of Black and Brown peoples, can be a sanctuary for individuals seeking asylum on the basis of racial persecution? It is precisely because granting asylum to an individual on the basis of demonstrated racial persecution or credible fear of fulfills the mandate of American supremacy, of the US as a rights-respecting and virtuous nation that is fundamentally distinct from our Southern neighbors. And this way, serving as an expert witness can also enable what Naomi Murakawa calls, quote, our collective on witnessing of carceral devastation. By witnessing the violence of anti-Black racism in Honduras, my declaration helps to secure asylum for an individual, a worthy goal. And at the same time, it renders the system of criminal injustice in the US and its inherent bias against historically racialized peoples a little more just. As such, we must also contend with the co-articulations of anthropological witnessing and the law, and how the meeting of these presumably distinct ways of knowing buttress the overarching forces of American supremacy. I'm going to stop my share now.
Okay, you know, Christopher, unfortunately, your slides didn't advance.
Oh, okay, that's okay. I'm going to conclude now. I'm on my conclusion.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me know, and apologies to the audience. Suwani's experiences of racialization, which transcend her own self-identity, allowed me to draw attention to the pervasiveness of anti-Black racism as a structuring logic with severe consequences for Black peoples. In other words, the abuse levied on her body could only be articulated as anti-Black racism if and when we look beyond the individual acts and instances of violence. Proving this, however, does little to undo the structural inequities that are endemic to the criminal justice system in the US and which continue to deny the vast majority of asylum seekers. Individual asylum seekers who are denied, many of whom have been forced to leave Honduras under conditions of great duress, are rendered criminal trespassers. They are then sent back to Honduras where they face dire odds, even death. This, as I have suggested, makes it possible for the United States to continue upholding the mythology of American supremacy and the wider belief that this country is an exceptional space of liberty and equality for all. Addressing how American supremacy factors into the work of Asylum is not to deny the real problems of state-sanctioned violence against Black and Indigenous peoples in Honduras, and which I document in detail in my work. However, by highlighting this contradiction, I believe we are better able to grasp the particular position of Blackness within these juridical moral configurations of power. We must grapple with the how and why of Asylum. This requires that we attend to the racial logics that play in the court and which require individuals to prove their innocence in order to obtain legally protected status. Reflecting on this contradiction and the political imperatives for abolition, Ruth Wilson Gilmore states, quote, "Getting rid of the rules that require people to prove their relative innocence in order to have some kind of protection from systems of oppression, whether it's the sistema de la muerte or other kinds of not necessarily mortal danger, but danger that accumulates as vulnerability to premature death, is part of what abolition must be. Until then, anthropologists will continue to use the tools available to us to advocate on behalf of migrants and their rights." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. We will move on now to James. James Cantres is an assistant professor in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College. His book, Blackening Britain, Caribbean Radicalism from Windrush to Decolonization, which came out last year, we're in 2020 and still trying to figure a year since COVID, details the social and political histories of community formation, race consciousness, anti-imperialism, and the quandary of multiculturalism among West Indian migrants in London in the decades following World War II. Commonly known as the Windrush generation, these imperial citizens reshaped British metropolitan culture and politics in subsequent decades. Professor Cantres explores the ways in which African diasporic art forms, radical intellectual pursuits, and Black power articulate belonging and unbelonging among Black peoples in Britain through the period of decolonization and independence in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. He was recently named a 2021 CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences Henry Wasser Awardee for outstanding research. His title of his presentation today is Belonging Neither Here Nor There, Caribbean Radicalism and Revolutionary Epistemologies Across the 1960s Black Atlantic.
Thank you so much. If it's okay, I'm just gonna not share a screen and read. If that works for everyone.
That's very okay.
Terrific, terrific. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone for spending some time. Post-1948 migrants from British-controlled territories in the Caribbean arrived to contribute to the rebuilding of Britain after World War II as newly minted citizens of the United Kingdom and Colonies, or CUKC. With equal rights to their British-born counterparts, they nevertheless encountered racial and ethnic exclusion while striving to belong and to take advantage of the employment and educational opportunities in the metropole. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act stringently restricted in-migration and also coincided with decolonization across British domains in the Caribbean and Africa. Radical activist intellectuals during decolonization resisted the politics of the old imperial order, as well as the immediate realities of the post-colony on each side of the Atlantic. In particular, networks of radical connectivity between Caribbean and African actors who contended with unbelonging across the Black Atlantic were also informed by radical knowledge-making and African and Caribbean ontologies. Upon the arrival of the Windrush ship in 1948, media hysteria, warned against the invading West Indians, arriving in Britain to hypothetically alter and transform the metropole in innumerous but only debilitating ways. Africans and Asians were thought often to be non-British foreigners, unable to assimilate and unwilling to acquiesce to some unspoken norms of British society. Concomitant with the post-war migration was the rise of the welfare state, and many metropolitan white Britons resented the prospect of foreigners living, quote, on the dole, unquote, and receiving social benefits despite the fact that they were citizens. Shop owners, pub operators, and landlords could express their displeasure with the colored presence through the rejection and exclusion of non-white tenants and clientele. So there are a couple of decades of resistance and sort of acquiescing to these politics of exclusion. And I'm going to jump ahead now to the 1960s. Right? The Jamaican Andrew Salkey opened the 1968 Caribbean Artists Movement Conference at the University of Kent by welcoming fellow Jamaican Stuart Hall, who was then deputy director of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham. Hall delivered a talk entitled West Indians in Britain, in which he suggested that rather than arriving for study, most of the migrants have, quote, come to work driven by deep and long-standing economic necessities, unquote. Diverging from his own experience, right, as of arriving in Britain as a student, Hall argued that the working class and less formally educated background of the migrants of the 1950s and 60s was rooted in a, quote, kind of historical idealism, a part of the history of migration out of the West Indies, unquote. Stymied by the lack of economic and educational opportunities at home, Hall suggested that the historical experience of financial and political disenfranchisement drove West Indians to Britain after the war. Himself having experienced the rarefied atmosphere of Oxford, Hall perhaps underestimated the perspectives of some West Indians and consequently privileged English perceptions and attitudes. He suggested that not until, quote, colored immigration has the final demystification of some areas of darkness in the English consciousness begun, unquote. For Hall, only through the phenomena of, quote, direct physical face-to-face, attitudes in the English experience have at least been brought to light. At least and at last, pardon me, been brought to light, unquote. Hall's relation to Englishness at this time complicated his presence at the CAM conference and may be read as a refutation of some of the linkages between Africa and its diaspora. He argued that, quote, the central experience in the formation of the West Indian personality is not and cannot be Africa, unquote. He claimed that between, quote, Africa and now, slavery and the deep insertion of a people into the depths of a plantation civilization and colonialism have intervened. Things that defined us in some crucial historical way is an experience which we share with other Caribbean islands and with the southern plantation of North America, unquote. Hall's formulation necessitates a close reading of the context of the CAM conference. Firstly, he postulated Africa and now as if the continent and its history were ahistorical remnants of an unknowable past. His distancing the West Indian and African experiences in some way conflicted with some of the work done by some of the leaders of the vanguard of the Caribbean artist movement, thinking particularly about folks like Kamal Brathwaite, who himself had sojourned in Ghana for 9 years before arriving in London. Hall, however, did recognize that the geographic spread of British Empire allowed for metropolitan citizens to remain ambivalent about the mechanisms of empire making. He noted that, quote, the whole imperial and colonial period was far away from the actual shores of this country, England. By having such a big empire out there, you could maintain a much nicer kind of atmosphere in here, unquote. He attributed articulations of racial prejudice in Britain to, quote, the intrusion of that group, the colonial group, into the society that cuts the distance between Westminster and Governor House, right, unquote. The spatial proximity of colony and metropole abutting one another for Hall fundamentally transformed the relationship of the mother country, in particular to its colonial subjects and citizens. Other conference attendees were more frustrated by the harsh treatment they encountered. Jamaican-born Edward Lucy Smith commented on Britain's hesitance when faced with West Indian presence when he remembered a poetry tour that he and Brathwaite had arranged across the West Midlands. After concluding their tour in Birmingham, Lucy Smith recalled that, quote, the presence of a highly intelligent Black intellectual threw mostly middle-class audiences into a state of violent social confusion. It was that voice, that Brathwaite voice coming out of that body, to put it bluntly, unquote. Despite audiences full of people of goodwill, Lucy Smith and Brathwaite were received by crowds questioning or discomfited by their presence. West Indian intellectuals, even in the privileged spaces of poetry performances, were met by British indignation. Brathwaite, at this point, recognized that through these experiences, he was, quote, upsetting the status quo. The Trinidadian John LaRose, who was one of the vanguard members of CAM, noted the diversity of Black radical ideas in the late 1960s. He remarked that after his visit in August 1967, quote, the effect of Stokely Carmichael was a catalyst in a way nothing before had been, unquote. Richard Small concurred with LaRose and noted the politics of Black people in Britain began to reflect a consciousness, quote, of themselves, not as immigrants in England, not as minorities, not as organizations, but in terms of the slogans of the Third World and Black power, unquote. Not content with a predetermined set of civil and social rights and sense of national belonging in Britain, Small argued for the radicalization of the Black political in Britain that conceptualized itself as a broader, more ambitious, and globally conscious. He insisted that in considering the potential role of the artists in the Black communities in Britain, he would encourage them to, quote, talk in terms of where we are, to lay the foundation for the international overthrow of racism, unquote. The accelerated and intensive nature of the emergence of Black power in the Caribbean reflected resistance to newly independent state executive power there as well. In 1969, a special correspondent for the Institute of Race Relations, a periodical Race Today, outlined the burgeoning Black power movement in the region. Because in the Caribbean, quote, the majority societies are biologically not white, but overwhelmingly Black, to many observers, the debate about Black power takes the form of a confrontation between the Black moderates in power and the small bands of Black left-wing revolutionaries who seek a second revolution to free West Indians from white economic neocolonialism, unquote. Caribbean cases, therefore, necessitate a reckoning with both the history of race relations and demography in the Caribbean and the perception of radical figures regarding these social phenomena in the early years after colonialism ends. Through resisting the preeminence of a small class of leaders, many of whom held positions of power during the late colonial era, Black power proponents of the 1960s Caribbean devised alternate political strategies oriented toward liberation, government accountability, and a racial reckoning. Political executives across the archipelago decried what they characterized as the, quote, violent aspects, unquote, of Black power, including the Trinidadian Prime Minister, Eric Williams, who had first banned Stokely Carmichael from the nation of his birth, and later counseled a meeting of young people to, quote, reject burn, baby, burn in favor of construct, baby, construct, unquote. Carmichael was beleaguered, right, by the Williams government, who declared him a criminal immigrant as he effectively mobilized Black power activists and activism from the United States to Great Britain and across other Black Atlantic geographies. Although principles of Black power varied from one place to the next, iterations of these movements nevertheless elicited responses from governments and residents across the Caribbean. In Dominica, for instance, a meeting of anti-Black power residents was held following, quote, violent statements by Black power advocates. The language of Black power resistance unnerved some in the Caribbean who found radical perspectives unsettling and violating more respectable political complaints. For many, during inaugural post-colonial moments, stability and civility were favored as key indicators of peaceful and reasonable transitions to sovereignty. Black power articulations, in turn, were seen as in conflict with and potentially degrading these values. Africans in Britain and on the continent also developed political outlooks that refuted state formation within Africa and resisted post-colonial legacies of the British Empire. A Nigerian-born novelist, playwright, and Black Power activist named Obi Egbuna offered a searing critique of the British imperial and post-colonial legacies and radical visions for the future in his 1973 work, The ABCs of Black Power Thought. Under the auspices of De-Negro Press, Egbuna disparaged various forms of media as perpetrating and reproducing images of racialized repression and exploitation, including choking Blacks daily, quote, in white culture. Egbuna's thoughts on the future of African states was articulated in his appraisal of post-colonial leadership and their connections to Europe. In a section called Decolonize the Mind, he lamented the contemporaneous phenomenon of, quote, every child born in Africa today being told that he cannot think until he goes to the elementary school. He cannot think till he goes to a university and gets a European degree, unquote. Egbuna proposed saving, quote, the intellectual from himself, then rescuing the nation from the intellectual. Then we must bring to an end this perennial loss of African brain power, unquote. He argued European universities only produce scholars and state agents who reproduce the worldviews of European exploitation. Egbuna argued that the education, quote, of our people must be in the hands of our own people, because who controls the mind of a people controls the people. He explained that skepticism toward Black power derived from twisted perspectives in both European and African and Caribbean contexts. Egbuna argued, quote, when an African student in London wants to get involved with the Black Power movement in Britain, he is told by the pundits that it's ridiculous to start a Black Power revolution in a white country, because the proper place for Black Power struggle is in his home country in Africa, unquote. Consequently, in Africa, Egbuna explained, quote, when the same African student talks about returning home to help pioneer a Black Power revolution, he is soon told by the very same pundits that it is ridiculous to start a Black Power revolution in an independent Black country because the country already has Black Power, unquote. He recognized that these critiques, baseless as he regarded them, nonetheless resulted in, quote, the poor confused student throwing up his hands, labeling Black Power unrealistic, and limiting his political activities to mouthing toothless abstractions at college debates. Black Power revolution then loses a potential combatant, and the pundits, with a smile of triumph, report back to the CIA headquarters that another nail has successfully been driven into the coffin of the Third World Revolution, unquote. Egbuna himself also remembered how Stokely Carmichael's address that roused the crowd at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in London in summer 1967 exposed the Black community in London to the rhetoric and consciousness of Black Power. He remarked, quote, that by the time Carmichael finished speaking, it had become evident that if he was lucky enough to get away from Britain without being arrested, he was destined to be banned from ever coming back, right, unquote. Egbuna further outlined a generational schema of Black politics over the course of the 20th century. Right? This is important in terms of thinking about knowledge making and the way in which people going from global South societies, right, and entering into these spaces. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to speed up. Sorry. So he talks about 3 different periods, and he's reflecting in the contemporaneous 3rd generation, and Egbuna declared his mission to, quote, make Black Power Pan-Africanism brought up to date, right? By the late 1960s, by way of conclusion, problems of acceptance in metropolitan Britain, coupled with resentment toward post-independence governments in the Caribbean, establish a context for radical strategies that appeal to more nuanced visions of freedom on each side of the Atlantic and across the global African diaspora. British citizenship was not the only pathway to recognition for radical intellectuals and artists who rejected the statist modalities of Britain and the Westminster-style governments that had replaced colonial ones, instead for new ingenious notions of freedom rooted in the shared experiences of exploitation and coalescing across Black Atlantic geographies. Thank you. Sorry about going over.
Thank you very much, James, for a very wide-ranging discussion. Looking forward to the comments when we get to that section. It is my pleasure to introduce Guerline Jozef, Executive Director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Ms. Jozef is both the executive director and co-founder of the Haitian Bridge Alliance, a coalition organized to assist thousands of Haitian refugees who often cross as many as 10 countries and 11 borders from Brazil to California in search of a better life. The Haitian Bridge Alliance's mission is to guide, elevate, and empower Haitian immigrants through advocacy, organizing, outreach, providing direct services included but not limited to immigrant detention visits, transitional housing. They also provide leadership assistance in partnership with UCI Law Clinic, the Public Law Center, and other allies' educational, social, and cultural programs so that Haitians may fully integrate into American society while maintaining their cultural heritage as they continue to navigate the complex immigration system in the US. Her organization was one of the first responders to the Del Rio crisis in Texas. Guerline Jozef was awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Awards this year for her leadership role in the Haitian Bridge Alliance. And on the group's website, her group was described as the, quote, only Black and Haitian women-led organization providing critical services and advocacy at the US-Mexican border. Her presentation is titled Where the Sun Don't Shine. It is my pleasure to invite Guerline Jozef to present.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me. I am having.
We can hear you now.
Right now.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for having us, and also Alexandra Miller, who invited us. Thank you for the entire center. And for the amazing panelists who came before me. I have learned so much from each and every one of you. And for the way that we started the panel with a brief history of Haiti in the United States and looking into mobility of people. And I will start by talking about the US-Haitian relationship, what we have experienced and seen under the bridge in Del Rio. How did we get there? We see a lot of people when we saw the news and we saw the pictures and the videos, we were shocked. The world stood idle watching the United States waging a war on Black bodies at the US-Mexico border. And where the sun don't shine is simply because what we experienced in September is something we have been talking about for a very long time. It is not a one-time occurrence. It was not an incident that happened. It is something we have been living with for a very long time. And we can look into the very system of immigration prison to begin with, how it is rooted in anti-Black racism, rooted anti-Haitian refugees coming to the United States. And we can take a quick look at how in the 1970s, 1980s, Haitians and Cubans were fleeing both political turmoils in Haiti and in Cuba, yet the Cubans were received, resettled, they prospered, and the Haitians were doomed and were called AIDS carriers to be caged in Guantanamo Bay, in Guam, giving way to the current immigration prison system we know today. So we are clearly understanding that the very notion of Black people in the United States is scary. And we have to highlight the fact that there have been hundreds of thousands of people coming to the US-Mexico border. And we also have to highlight family separation that took to the streets under the previous administration in 2018, but ignoring the family separation crisis of Haitian migrants in 2015 and 2016. and how we, as we continue to talk about the way Black bodies migrate from the United States, from Cameroon, to the United States from Haiti, from Cameroon, LGBTQ members from Jamaica, people fleeing modern day slavery in Mauritania, to make a journey that I still yet to understand how people survive. It is beyond my understanding. Yet we see when Black bodies are in motion, there is no safe place for us. There is no way that we can call home. There is no way that we can be protected. As you heard from Professor Cantres with the Garifuna people in Honduras, they are unsafe at home, unsafe during the journey, unsafe at the border, unsafe no matter where we find ourselves. Now I can just mention the invisible wall. We had a report that came out earlier this year where we interviewed 30 Haitian women who made the journey from Haiti after the earthquake, the first earthquake, who went to Brazil. And they were in Brazil for 5 years. They were part of the workforce that helped build for the Olympics and for the World Cup. Unfortunately, after the political turmoil started in Brazil, the economy downfall as well pushed them to live once more in what we call chercher la vie, looking for life. And once they found themselves barely making it out of the Panama jungle, the Darien, through the ups and downs, the rivers, the mountain of Colombia, to arrive in Mexico, to be imprisoned in Tapachula, that has been used as a state prison, a city used as a prison to cage migrants and prevent them from continuing their journey. And some of those women shared how they have been treated as less than human. And one of them asked, don't we deserve to breathe like they do? Or don't we have blood in our veins like they do? Our children, aren't they human like theirs? The pain we have heard and seen in the faces of women, Black women, Haitian women, making the journey is unbearable. And so as we look into what we saw under the bridge, and we continue to ask how, why, when did all of this begin? And we clearly understand, oh, I'm having internet issues again. Can you see me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Can you see me?
No, we can't see your face, but we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I hear you, but my camera disappeared. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, you're back. And the sound never went.
Okay, wonderful. And as we witness how the United States continues to push the US border all the way down to Panama, and we hear the unfortunate mistreatment of how people are disappearing, and when we hear women being raped on the way and being made to push through, and when we see the internal violence in the country as a result of years and years of policies, of foreign US policies that has crippled the country to a place of complete despair. And as the previous panelists talked before, I believe it was Professor Miller who talked about the relationship between the United States and Haiti, but look deeper into the relationship of the international community, the relationship of the West, forcing Haiti into deeper depression on top of political turmoil that has amplified the violence, the kidnapping, and all of those issues we are witnessing in Haiti right now. Understanding as the first Black Republic, the second nation in the Americas has been made to not only continue to suffer, to pay because they dare to exist. And what I want to bring to our attention as we speak about the African diaspora, now imagine people that were taken from different tribes in Africa, brought to the Americas. They created their own home, their own language, their own country, their own people, and give themselves freedom. Not free because they paid for it. They bled, they died, they won, yet unacceptable to exist. So this is what we are looking at. And I know as well, other people have talked about the Black experience and how we see the fear of the Black people, the reality of how people are being treated, not just in the Americas, understanding that anti-Black racism is a world issue. We continue to see the result of what we have seen in the Rio under the bridge. I am trying to be cognizant of the time as well, but we are seeing also when we talk about borders, who are borders made for? If you are a millionaire, you can have your own private jet, there is no borders for you. But if you are running for your lives, then there is a border that makes sure you do not get the protection that you need. So the very idea, the construct of border itself, is an idea that has been created to make sure those who are in need of protection, those who are the most vulnerable, do not get the support. Because when we look into the United States and we look at Texas and we look at Ted Cruz, for example, when we had this storm in Texas, it was easy for him to take his family and went to Mexico in search of safety. Yet that same privilege is not offered to people who are running from extreme violence, from extreme danger, from political issues, from natural disasters, from earthquake, to be afforded that same opportunity. Where the sun don't shine is really highlighting the realities that make sure people who are suffering, people who are in need, do not get the support that they need. I remember visiting a young man in immigration prison in Orange County. And when I arrived, I met him and I asked him, what is wrong? Because he was looking as if he saw a ghost. And he told me he was in that prison as an asylum seeker for a year. And I was the first person who came to visit him. And I made sure that I went back to see him again. And he was so happy that time. And I said, why are you so happy? And he looked at me and said, Madame, today is the second day that I was able to feel the sun on my skin. Because where I am, the sun doesn't shine. So today, we honor his life and the lives of all those who have been lost in immigration prison, especially Black migrants from Cameroon and others who are still caged. And today, as we are sitting here, and we will continue to highlight the lives of those people. And as we stand today, 80 flights of deportation sent to Haiti, and people calling, asking for support. People asking for a way to survive. Cherchez la vie. So I didn't mean to be so emotional, but as I'm looking and I'm seeing the face of this young man who told me that was the second time that he was able to feel the sun on his skin, because where he was caged, there were no sun shining upon him. So I apologize for being emotional today. However, I think it is necessary for us as a people to make sure we highlight the voices of those who are lost, forgotten, disappeared, erased their realities. And we're getting messages and calls asking what happened to the people who were under the bridge. To date, over 8,000 of them have been deported to Haiti, have been sent to Haiti. Many of them are children who were born in Chile, in Brazil, at the US-Mexico border because they were forced to wait for over 5 years. So we see the fear of Blackness, the fear of little girls and little boys, and the parents asking for protection. In the United States, reaction to that was to take them, erase them, abuse them, and disappear them. So I think I will stop here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so very much for reminding us that ultimately we're talking about human beings, we're talking about their lives. And for most of us here, these are topics that we feel strongly about, but it's not the same as experiencing these things yourself. So I think it helps us to be reminded that we're talking about real human beings. So thanks for bringing back the emotion into what can sound like very dry academic, a very dry academic discussion. I would really be grateful if you guys can turn your cameras on so that we can actually feel that we're talking to people, real people, and not just blank screen. Thank you guys so very much. This was a fabulous panel. I mean, there's just so much going on. I think what immediately strikes me is Guerline's presentation and Christopher's and the seeming disconnect. Because on the one hand, you're talking, Christopher, about race being a basis for granting asylum, racial discrimination. And yes, we know that that doesn't operate beyond the border in a sense. We know that, you know, race is illegitimate once you cross the border and you're in the state. So you can ignore Black people, they can be invalid, their claims can be invalid, especially since, of course, it's America, it's the greatest, you know, country in the world. American exceptionalism doesn't really have space to consider race. But then you have Haitians at the border, and there's a huge difference in treatment between Haitians at the border and what we saw in Del Rio, and what you mentioned about the individual asylum cases. And I'm wondering how, and it's a question for both of you, how do you address this disconnect? Do you think that there is a coherent US immigration policy, or do you think that there are serious disconnections going on across the various systems that deal with immigration?
I can start. I think there's many discrepancies as to how the welcoming of migrants, of asylum seekers and immigrants within the US. You know, so for example, and I tell people all the time, the previous administration, President Trump, I don't believe that, you know, his main thing was immigration or immigrants. At the end of the day, the White House was inhabited by immigrants, right? The First Lady was an immigrant, therefore the children, all of his children were first generation Americans. So, you know, all immigrants themselves. But what they want is immigrants from Norway, as he mentioned. And what they do not want is immigrants from Haiti. immigrants from shithole countries, immigrants from African countries, immigrants from majority Black countries. So what they don't want is brown immigrants that he has called rapists and murderers. So absolutely, the immigration system itself is fully rooted in racism and specifically in anti-Black racism. So every single aspect can be traced back to that reality. And again, the fear of Haitians, migrants entering the United States to increase the Black population is another aspect of how we are looking into the browning of America. So it would have been what I have asked even President Biden, if those people who were under the bridge and the people who are still at the US-Mexico border, if they were from Norway, would they have been treated and being beaten and abused by men on horseback? So that is the reality. If we are to be honest with ourselves, the answer will be no. They will be welcomed with dignity, provided for so that they can succeed. But the fear of Blackness in America is one of the main reasons we witnessed what we witnessed under the bridge and continue to witness today.
Thank you, Guerline. There's a comment in support of your perspective from Jerry Augusto. Isn't it the very deep embeddedness of anti-Black racism in the USA which helps inform the border policies of the USA? Is that policy not, among other things, one more phenomenon in the wake of slavery? But Christopher, and I think that's what where the disconnect is for me. How does that translate into race being a legitimate basis for asylum? Because that is in diametric opposition to everything that we, the last comments addressed. So would you like to take a shot at that? What's happening here?
Sure. I think, well, first I want to thank Guerline for that very powerful presentation. And I want to reiterate many of the interventions that she made around anti-Blackness and the particular kind of anti-Black characteristics of US immigration policy historically and today. So it's precisely this question that led me to write this paper, and it's actually part of a larger chapter I was invited to submit for a book project on the anthropology of white supremacy. But it was this experience of going repeatedly into asylum court to testify as an expert witness on behalf of Black migrants, Black identified migrants from Honduras for the most part, and having this very jarring kind of realization that the testimony I provided was in fact very crucial for the outcome of the cases, in which almost all of the claimants did in fact receive asylum. And so it led me to sort of delve into this contradiction that you're pointing to, Patsy, which is, how is it that in the US, a country that is known worldwide for being a country that has been inhospitable and brutally violent towards Black and brown people and indigenous folk, how is it that now the US immigration system is granting asylum to these individuals, and how does that play into these larger narratives, right, around kind of American exceptionalism or American supremacy? That's sort of where I was brought into this conversation, or how I was brought into it. And the only thing that I could conclude was that if we know that kind of laws around racism in this country are predicated on notions of kind of individual violations and individual victims, right? So you can have cases where the court recognizes that an individual did experience racist violence and racist persecution, and therefore should have the right to be in this country as an asylee or a refugee. But that does nothing for, to undo these larger systems of racialized criminalization, which, as Guerline pointed out, is the immigration prison system, but also the criminal justice system writ large in the United States. And so it's a new area of research or of investigation for me. Some of these ideas are just forming now. But I really do just appreciate the resonances actually between the different presentations that we heard today.
Thank you. Talking about resonances, I found the concept that came up in Guerline's talk of the US pushing the border back to Panama resonated with Juanita Cabrera Lopez's discussion about the US policy actually freezing people in place, long before they arrive at the US border. And so in other words, the border between the US and Latin America doesn't stop at the Mexico border. It actually goes all the way back to Panama, or as far back as you can think about it. And it raises, I know you have your hand up, Mimi, and you can ask your question since your hand is up, but it brings me to your question. And that also comes back to Christopher Loperena's discussion about the Garifuna. Who are these? There are already people who have sovereignty over mobility, right? We know them. They already have they can make any space they want their own. They can move. And so the concept, I think we need to start by accepting that, or considering that there's already that kind of sovereign mobility for some people. The question is, how are you going to think of that notion in a way that addresses power imbalances, and what is the politics of that? And aligned to that is the whole question of the commons. And how is that related to the dispossessed indigenous people's claims for rights to be grounded in physical spaces in ancestral lands? So I thought there's a bit of a tension there that I thought, I could ask you to explore.
Yeah, thanks, Patsy. And I had my hand up just earlier because I wanted to comment on, first of all, thank you for all of you for your amazing, powerful talks. And Guerline, I'm so sorry for the tragedy and the trauma that people are living through, and that you're experiencing as well with them. And I was thinking about this idea of the individualized rescue, and it made me think about humanitarian rescue and the way in which orphans became this object of humanitarian rescue. And in Haiti, so many missions and missionaries and NGOs have set up orphanages and are taking Haitian children out of Haiti. And that's like a weird way that they individualize and then justify themselves, right, as the white saviors of a certain kind of Blackness that is infantilized in a way, right? So there's some parallel there in terms of the juridical system also performing a kind of rescue of some people on the basis of some racialized embodiment. So that's interesting to think with. But as to Patsy's question, and I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, and it comes back to this question of what is the relation between indigeneity and a prior claim to the land and the people who are African descendants in the Americas, what's called the arrivants, those who have arrived, not as colonists, but arrived through enslavement and then created a culture, right? And I think what's increasingly being noted is that there's a tie, there's a relationship between indigenous Caribbean Maroon peoples and Afro-descendant peoples who all have a claim to the land and share ties with each other, right? And there was a question earlier in the Q&A that's, I don't know why it's disappeared, about whether Haitians recognized themselves as Taino, and the question about comparing that to Puerto Ricans. And
why don't I read it for you one time so you can also answer it?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Would you say that Haiti has an awareness, or Haitians have awareness of their Taino roots and ancestors? What I think role for public policy regarding this indigenous, recognizing this indigenous element? And the question stems from the Dominican case, where very few people would identify as Taino, and Puerto Rico, where a sizable proportion does identify as Taino.
Yeah, and I see Guerline has her hand up, and so I'm not going to speak for what Haitians, consider their identity, but I'll just say that there's a great deal of interest now in recognizing that there were Taino people who did not all succumb to genocide, right? Although the Spanish arrival attempted that, and the Columbus plantations there, but that there was a mixture of peoples, of culture, of spiritual beliefs. And in Vodou, we can see and feel some of the remaining power of those spiritual belief systems. And that's where the commons and commoning that I'm trying to link to Laku, which again can be seen as having both African and indigenous roots in Haiti, is an important concept for getting us away from the individual rights-based property regimes of ownership, which were rejected by Haitians. I'll stop there. I'll let Guerline.
Yeah, I like to say that we fully embrace our indigenous background, and we honor Anakaona, we honor Kaonabo, the peoples upon whose land we have become owner, as well as the Maroon people who literally binded themselves with the native of the land. And our language itself, Creole, our identity, honor, respect, and make sure that we include our Taino ancestry as part of who we are as a people. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, is of Taino descent. So we fully embrace who we are as a people of different tribes, taken from Africa, and also of our ancestors such as Anakaona, Kaonabo, and all those who bind themselves together to create a new people, a new nation, a new language, and a new identity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Please ask your questions, raise your hands. In the meantime, I'm going to ask, and please, Christopher has his hand up. So you go on, Christopher.
I don't want to speak too much, but I just find this conversation that Mimi and Guerline are having right now very important. And Garifuna are, of course, mobilizing as Indigenous and Black, or Black Indigenous. They are of Carib, Arawak, and African descent. And so making claims to indigeneity is fundamental to the kind of rights struggles of Garifuna people in Honduras and in the diaspora. And it has also been a means by which the state has exercised its policies of anti-Blackness by attempting to disavow Garifuna indigeneity on the basis of their perceived kind of Africanness and outsiderness in relation to the Honduran nation state. So it's a very important issue, and I'm glad that we're discussing it. That's all.
Thank you. James, I find your discussion of the different attitudes towards Black power in the UK, but also what I see as what you suggest as the social differences between somebody like Stuart Hall and the way he talks about belonging and Blackness, and how that was received by people from a different social background. Fascinating, because that element of the kind of social, we never think about that operating in the States. I just want to hear a bit more about that. And I wasn't quite sure, and that's me, that's not your presentation. where the lines on Black power were drawn in the Black community, especially around class. If you could comment on that.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think it's complex because there are these simultaneous efforts, right, in the 1950s and 60s from different sectors of the migrant communities of arrivants from Africa and the Caribbean and Britain, right? So you do have a kind of intellectual class who might be at LSE or Cambridge or Oxford, and you may also have a much larger class of folks who are coming who in many cases have been recruited, right, in really successful attempts by British industry, right, to ensure that the losses of World War II could be recouped, or at least that the political economy could be restabilized by inviting, some of the nearly billion people who were under colonial rule, British colonial rule at that time, to come and contribute to whether it was transit, right, or mining, right, and very much to the hospital and the emergent kind of National Health Service, right, that then meant that there were different ways in which people were relating to themselves as citizens of the state, right, I guess I would say, right? So I think that you can think about, I think it's in 1963, there's a bus boycott in Bristol, right, because the bus company in Bristol will not hire Black and brown bus drivers, right? Even though there are thousands of them who have arrived specifically for the purpose to do these jobs. And then the bus company decides we're not going to hire people, right? Because our trade unionists have their own feelings about their capacity to do this labor. So then in response, there's a months-long bus boycott, right, of the Bristol Omnibus Company, right? This is being done on a grassroots level by working class people, right? Without the leadership, right, or without the kind of framework or orientation being the product of some kind of intellectual reckoning with, is this fair as citizens that we need to be, that we also deserve jobs, right? So I think that there are some tensions between, not necessarily a conflict, right, or even an adversarial relationship. I don't mean to suggest that the working class and the sort of ivory tower are pitted against one another, but they may be aiming, and at least elements of these different sectors may be aiming towards different kinds of goals at the same time. I think maybe that's a fuller way of expressing it. Sorry.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Guerline had her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell James, I'm just fascinated by the history specifically of the African diaspora in England. And I was speaking to my friend from Jamaica about the treatment of nurses who went to Jamaica, and then after their rendered service, they were still not considered to be citizens, even their children. If that's something you can quickly touch on, we'll really appreciate that.
Sure. Well, people were legally naturalized, but within the last 15 years, there have been a host of British Home Department, right, and the agency, I don't know if it's still called the Aliens wing or of the Home Department, which has effectively sought to denaturalize a whole generation's worth of people, many of whom actually were not ever born in the former colonies, but themselves were born in Britain and didn't have kind of the paperwork, or the paperwork was destroyed. There were all kinds of documentation that then has now led to the banishment, right, and the eventual sending away, right, of people from the Caribbean in particular back to Caribbean islands. Yeah.
And the flow of nurses and skilled people to the UK and the US continues. So it's not just a historic flow, but the Windrush generation suggests that when you've served your purpose, then you can, suddenly ask somebody to prove that they've been here for the last 50 years. Mimi has a comment in the chat. The struggle against extractive industries in Central America, the Caribbean, South and North America also unites Indigenous and Black frontline environmental justice movements across borders and identities. And Christopher agrees. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, this was a fascinating panel. I think it was an excellent note. It's an excellent note on which to end. This has been an absolutely fabulous, rich engagement these 2 days. I think we managed to bring together an exceptional group of people to reflect on very real issues and to look at the contradictions, possible way forward, just to try to understand what's going on a bit more. 2 things have stuck with me. It's the image, I think, again, that was coming from Juanita Cabrera Lopez's paper of these migrants whose borders have been arrested long before they get to Mexico to go to the US, and who are marooned in Choctaw Maya territory. And the idea that this then becomes the responsibility of this group of people. And there was a picture accompanying it. It was just so resonant that, it stuck with me as a story that we don't really hear about when we think of people moving across different borders to get in Central America to get to the US. The other thing that really, I really felt proud of our students at Brown, I have to say. The idea that you have these young people who are, for some of them, it's an aspect of their own reality that they are exploring, but that you have this budding generation of scholars, activists, just citizens, human beings who are already thinking so very deeply about the conditions of fellow human beings who are forced out of their place to try to find existence somewhere else, a better life. And I'm so grateful that we had these young people reflecting along with us so we can learn from them and draw from their insights. But there are so many fascinating discussions, ways of seeing immigration that, and nobody wants me at 3:38 to rehash that. So I want to use this opportunity for closing remarks to just give thanks. And there are lots of people that we need to give thanks to. First, all of you who answered our call, were very generous with your time and your ideas to come and on Zoom, no less, to talk about your work and to share, to become a part of a community with us. And I'm really grateful that you were able to do this. I want to thank Professor Ed Steinfeld, who is the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, for his comments and his really excellent job of summarizing, the range that we're covering in this conference. I want to thank For those of you who were able to be here last night and saw the performers that I have to thank, the small group that worked to put this event together: Kate Goldman, our center manager at Clark's, Kristen Collins, who is our postdoctoral Sawyer Seminar Fellow, and Rich Snyder, Professor Rich Snyder, professor in the Political Science Department. And they perform magic to bring Frontera Boogaloo, Danger AK, and Laura Guevara to perform for us last night. And of course, the people who made all of this seem seamless and fun really brought the fun out. The two DJs that held everything together: Raul Castellanotto and Eduardo Pinelos, and their group Martes de Salsa. Of course, I have a debt of gratitude to my fellow collaborators, Tony Bogues and Brian Meeks, and really grateful to you for your support, proposing this together, and staying with it as well. The members of the General Brown community who have been very helpful in helping us to fine-tune the proposals that allowed us to have the Sawyer Seminar proposal, that allowed us to be able to win this grant. Joe Meisel, Rebecca Rex, Corey Sylvia, Karen Ball. I also want to thank Kate, who also looked at a draft of the proposal and was a very important source of knowledge about local community groups we could reach out to, but as well about Central American migration. So thanks to Kate for her input in the project conceptualization as well. The Sawyer Seminar Steering Committee, we have an incredible group that is working with us to bring these ideas that on paper into reality. Jerry Augusto, who is in the audience, Pablo Rodriguez. Pablo, I've seen you the entire conference. So I'm grateful that, that you were there, throughout. Layla Lennon, Patricia Figueroa, Maya Rivers Gamble, Richard Snyder, Lisa Biggs, Andrea Flores, Kevin Escudero, and Kate Goldman. We also have an amazing steering committee at Clark's, who again has been very helpful with comments and suggestions: Evelyn Hugh DeHart, Laura Lopez Sanders, Pedro Dalbo, Juliet Hooker, Colin Channer, Neil Safer. And very, very important, our organizing committee here at Clark's: Kate Goldman, Kristen Collins, Erica Durante, who is an undergraduate coordinator, studies coordinator, director, of undergraduate studies, Alexandria Miller, who is our Sawyer doctoral fellow, who is in Africana Studies Department, Karen Mota, our other postgrad Sawyer Seminar Fellow, who is in Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, and two graduate proctors, Lubaba Chaudhry and Aisha Sanley, who worked with us over the summer. And Frank Batista Kunhardt. Frank was very helpful in pointing some very important presenters our way and has been working with us as well. Frank is in the Masters of Public Administration program here, and he's one of 10 Watson Directors Fellows in that program. And we are eternally grateful. And I don't know what we do with all the Watson Institute Communications team of Ellen White, Alex LaFerriere, and John Master. And if I've forgotten anybody, it's not out of malice. It's just, it is Friday at the end of 2 wonderful days. And, the mind may not be, in it at its peak, but thank you so very much.